Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Kendrick. I'm the state ornithologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I appreciate Shelley and Anne and all the folks who have helped plan the webinar series. This is a really fun topic to talk about. We're going to talk about the power of eBird and how it ties into relevancy discussions. For the first hour, I'm going to kind of give some background on eBird, what it does, how it's pretty revolutionary, and how it can help us states in those relevancy discussions of how to reach new audiences. So I will hand it over for one moment to my co-host, Scott Anderson, to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Scott Anderson. I'm a state ornithologist with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And yeah, I'm excited. I appreciate everyone setting this up. It's great. Yeah, I'm excited to give the second half of this presentation and a bit of the first half, just sort of all examples of how eBird has been used, and in the second half I'll talk a little bit more about the details about how and if you should gather that data on your own from eBird. So thanks.
Cool, thanks, Scott. Yeah, so we're very excited to be here today. eBird can really help us to have this discussion about relevancy. Scott and I both we're very invested in getting folks in the outdoors, and one of those ways is to birdwatch. We both are the coordinators for our state birding trails. And so, yeah, we'll get into some of the technicalities that Scott is better versed in than myself in the second hour. So that'll be more technical how-to. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we get into eBird and those data, first off, I wanted to look at some other data to show that wildlife viewing is clearly a big deal. I feel like most of us on the call understand this, but to just kind of set the stage a little bit with some numbers. So this is, again, I'm sure many of you have already seen this. This is the 2016 National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation. It's a very popular report. So I just want to walk through a few stats from this report. So there are more than double the wildlife watchers than there are our number there of hunters and anglers, almost double of hunters and anglers. And but there are a few things to note here. So the point of this is not to compare throughout this whole presentation. It's not to compare consumptive versus non-consumptive outdoor use. I think that's short-sighted. I know many agencies struggle with that argument. And game versus non-game, and I don't want to make it about that at all. I do think it is short-sighted because it assumes that hunters and anglers are not also wildlife watchers, which I feel that many are. I am a waterfowl hunter, as you can see in the background here, and so I am one of those that is both. And so I'm not trying to pit consumptive versus non-consumptive in the least. I present these numbers only to set the stage, to give context for how wildlife watchers, how many there are and what they're doing out there. Well, it turns out they're spending money. So when we look at the total expenditures for wildlife watchers and sports persons, the numbers are very comparable. So for wildlife watchers, they're spending about $75.9 billion as opposed to sports persons, which is 81 million. So it's up there. They're spending a lot of money, of course, on equipment, lodging, fuel, transportation, things like that. And you just look at these billions of 2016 dollars and how that's increased since 2006. And, you know, some of us in the game know that this has increased even more since 2016. And one way to know that is through eBird. So this is a Missouri specific report that we got through these partners listed here at the bottom. And in terms of wildlife values, we see a lot of interest, both past on the left, current in the middle, and in the future, especially of wildlife viewing, which is the light blue bar on the right of each of those groups. So we see there's just a lot of interest. You know, most of us on the call clearly know this. And then how reliant are they on public lands? Well, very reliant. This is my hideous circle I drew.
Hey, Sarah.
Yes.
Hey, I'm seeing the slide with wildlife watching equals dollar. Oh, now I'm seeing that. Maybe it's just I just want to make sure it wasn't just me that was seeing a lag there. So
no problem, and that's good to point out. Some of you may have a lag on the slides, and that's probably network issue, but yeah, it's advancing on my end. It may just take a second, but that's good to know. Okay, so these folks, they're wildlife watchers, are clearly very reliant on public land. Some people are only wildlife watching on public land only, outside of just their homes or on private land, and so that's important for us to note as well. And so what is this relevancy discussion? If you work for a state agency, you likely know. If you're not, state fish and wildlife agencies are.
Here, she's back. Sarah, you're back. Now you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, it said recording in progress when it came back on. So I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
I will start.
All right. Share slides again and we'll be good to go.
I don't think I'm the host anymore. That's an issue.
Okay, let me make you the host.
Sorry, everybody.
Maybe.
I don't know what happened.
I don't know. No, Scott became the host. Scott, can you make Sarah a host? Fun of
Meeting without technical difficulty. Okay.
He made you the host.
Did that work?
Yeah.
Yep, she's all powerful again.
I'm all powerful. Can you see my slides or my notes?
Slides. We see the relevancy
Slides.
roadmap slide.
Okay, where did I cut off? You just want me to start over here?
You might go back
Let's
one
start
slide.
here.
Okay, hold on. I will start. Okay, so what is this relevancy discussion? So if you work for a state agency, you likely know, but if not, I'll just briefly describe. So state fish and wildlife agencies are working to, quote, engage and serve broader audiences. So with hunting and angling trends going down and with changing social and demographic trends in the US and outside the country, we must adapt to that. So how do we remain relevant to our diverse public? How do fish and wildlife agencies remain relevant in times of change with those fewer connections between the public and nature? And so we want to be relevant not only to changing demographics, but to a diversity of outdoor activities and interests. So wildlife watchers are one of those engaged demographics, and more specifically birders. And so clearly the stats on wildlife watching and bird watching really feed into these discussions and how important that is. And so another thing that the relevancy roadmap developed by AFWA recognizes is that widespread change is happening both within agencies and with constituencies, like I just mentioned, and in the context of some political constraints that we have. And so our big goal is to diversify these messages of our agencies and programs to reach a broader audience. And I think that includes bird watching. So we'll get into eBird here. So the birder activity I discussed today is quantified by eBird checklists and activity on the eBird website. And so eBird.org is a massive online database of birder checklists. It sorts and maintains birder checklists, but it's contributing to science and conservation given its massive global reach. This isn't just in the US or North America, this is global. The app is available in over 40 languages. So again, it's this mega database. Just to give you some context of numbers here, there have been 56 million checklists uploaded worldwide via eBird in all time. And it really just came around in 2009. And it was, it's really ramped up in popularity every single year since then by leaps and bounds. I think in the last 5 years, it's about 20 or 25% growth or 20% annually in eBird. So it's really, really, really ramping up. And so there are 692,000 eBirders. There's hundreds of millions of sightings uploaded to eBird per year. Regional experts verify these rare birds and outliers so that it's not anybody can get on their phone on their eBird app and say they saw any bird ever. If there are rarities or weird ones, there are regional people who ask for more documentation or try and verify those reports. eBird is in real time. So if I plan this weekend to go to a conservation area near me, and I can go to that site on the eBird website, which I'll show you here in a moment, and I can see what Scott saw there yesterday. I could even see what he saw there 2 minutes ago if he's uploaded his eBird list. And so it's up to the minute. It really helps folks get out and see a lot of rare birds, but also just peruse what people are seeing at different times of year. It consolidates all those data. eBird is a beautiful marriage between bird nerds and computer nerds, and it really synthesizes these bird data into really cool, eye-catching ways to educate the public. So it began as a way to manage your life list and your bird checklist. When you're out and about, you can organize your bird life list by county, by country, by state. But really, it's grown into something a lot more useful. It's the largest citizen science effort ever. It's adding to worldwide data and adding to science monitoring and conservation. One way that this is occurring is it's given its global and hemispheric reach, and due to the ramping up of numbers of bird checklists submitted on a lot of our migratory birds' wintering grounds, we can now model their full life cycle and abundance therein in different times of year. So there are a lot of efforts between states and, of course, international bird conservation organizations of where to target habitat and conservation efforts for our migratory birds that spend time and breed up where we are, and then where they're spending time for up to 8 months of the year elsewhere. We can't ignore that time that they're outside the country. So I'm going to click this. They have abundance maps and these animations for 600 to 700 species on the eBird website, and that's a pretty new development to have that many. They've had a few hundred, but they really ramped up by dumping hundreds and hundreds more in the last few months. And so I'm going to click this. It goes through the weeks of the year over here. And this shows where the birds are most abundant. This is for wood thrush. They're down there in the Yucatan and Belize. And you see as it goes through May, June, and July, they're up on the breeding grounds. They kind of consolidate in the fall, and then they hop the Gulf again and go down to their wintering grounds. So this is not only useful to conservation, it's captivating, eye-catching. It really resonates with the public. I don't think I've ever shown these animations during a public presentation and the room doesn't gasp. I mean, it's just a really cool way to visualize migration and the beauty and like really miracle of migration in my mind to quantify that and show abundance. This is the eBird checklist leaderboard. So the United States submits the most checklists. That makes sense because that's where this originated. So each time I give this eBird presentation, I have to go to the eBird website and update all my numbers because it changes like that. I mean, today there's going to be a lot more checklists listed for the United States than yesterday even. And so just for some context, the last time I updated this presentation was in January of 2020, and there's 10 million more checklists for the United States since that time. So it's just crazy. The numbers here are just really staggering. So another point I wanted to make with this leaderboard is that, you know, Canada, Australia, but also India, Spain, the UK, I mean, this really is a global phenomenon. One of the funnest things to show the public when you talk about eBird too is the live submission map. And so this is an active website where you go to the website and you see these little yellow dots pop up on the screen when someone submits an eBird list. And you can just sit there and watch the screen, and globally, the light gray dots are all the dots that had been submitted on the day I looked at this on June 2nd. Those are all the dots that had been submitted that day. It restarts the count every day. You see at noon on June 2nd, there had already been 19,000 checklists submitted from all over the world. Look at all these light gray dots. It's crazy. So website is there, you know, by noon. They'd already had that many. And by the time I took this screenshot and then wrote this text box, there were 61 more checklists submitted. So we're just talking about off the charts largest database for one taxa. So on eBird, you can also search by hotspot. And so I just put in Missouri. And then when I zoom down, I can see all the hotspots. And then the different colorations are the number of species observed at each one. So if I click on Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area, which is right outside of where I live in Columbia, Missouri, you click on that, and then you can see the most recent species recorded at that area. So it's organized by date here, but you can organize by count. You can click on first seen, the high counts for that area. You can look at bar charts over here on the left, which shows you which species occur at that area during different times of year, when they're absent, when they're there. It's just really interesting. Excuse me. You can also search by species. So if you go to species maps, I put in cerulean warbler, and at that macro level, when you're zoomed out really far, you just see purple. But when you zoom in, you can see all of the checklists at all of the locations on which a cerulean warbler has been detected. So all of these different dots are all checklists where ceruleans have been detected. When you click on one of these icons, you see the area, the hotspot, Ozark National Scenic Riverways, and then these are all bird checklists that include ceruleans with the date. This has a audio recording right here. You can see from that icon, this has a comment and this has a photo. And so you can click on all of those things. It includes a lot of information. I already showed you this, so I'm going to zoom through here, but these are just a few more of these because I think they're cool. I had to put in a Western and a grassland bird for you grassland bird folks, but even a quote unquote resident bird or shorter distance migrant, you can see just how different parts of the United States and Canada and its range are important to this bird at different times of year. And all of that plays into full life cycle conservation. To put my ornithologist hat on, all that plays into full life cycle conservation and conservation efforts throughout that life cycle. So eBird data is available to us. So I forgot to mention that eBird is a project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Of course it is. But I want to, Scott made this slide when we've given this presentation before, and it's really, really important to talk about what someone is submitting when they submit a bird checklist. These are the data that we can draw out and use to help quantify both birding activity, the importance of our state managed lands, which I'll get to, and also the number of eBirders there are out there, people who are registered with the eBird app. And so you look at a checklist is one instance of birding. So I open up the eBird app on my phone, I click start track. It tracks my distance traveled throughout the time of the list. It tracks the time, and you can edit all that stuff at the end. You put in, of course, it has observer. And when you download the data, it doesn't have anybody's name. You have an eBirder unique ID, which is a number. But that's the person submitting the checklist. You can share your list. If you're out birding with your buddy, they're also on eBird. You just put their name on there and automatically shares to their information, and it's not double counted. You put in each species you see, you put the quantity of birds that you see while you're out there. So if I hear 6 indigo buntings over the course of a half mile on a hike, I put in all 6 of those. Date and time, of course, it's auto-filling that through your app. And duration and distance, it's also auto-filling that as well. You can turn off the tracking if you don't want it to follow you around. But at the end of your checklist, if you did have tracking on, it shows you the exact path you took through the area, which also helps other birders figure out where you may have seen so-and-so bird. You choose a type, a checklist type, whether it's traveling, you hike a mile, stationary, you're just standing in one spot, you just saw one bird or 2 or 3, submitted that, or incidental, which is just you detected one species in a certain spot, you weren't making a full list. And so location, it's auto-filling all that stuff if you have your location on, or you just choose a hotspot near you. So you're getting lat-long information on there as well, which is important to our efforts to quantify that stuff by state. So this is just one example of something simple you can do on the public-facing eBird website. So there have been discussions in Missouri about wetland conservation and wetland intensive management of our wetland areas, which costs a lot of money. So we wanted to look and see how many people were using our wetlands, our MDC conservation areas, and wetlands in general in the state for birdwatching. So what you do to find this page, you click on Explore, then you click Regions. Each state is a region. So I just put in Missouri, and then it takes me to this page. I can look at the number of species observed in Missouri. All you big species states, don't laugh at little Missouri with our 417 species. You can look at how many checklists have been submitted just for Missouri. This is the number of eBirders in Missouri or have eBirded in Missouri. This is how many counties, and then hotspots. So I clicked on hotspots so I can see the top hotspots by species recorded there. So this isn't the number of checklists, the most visited, although those are correlated. It has the number of species that have been detected at those sites. When I highlight the areas on this top 13 list that are wetlands, it's pretty obvious that most of the top species records in the state via eBird are on wetland areas. So just to give you some context, for 318 species being detected, around 300 for most of these wetland areas, and there's only about 335 species that naturally, occur commonly annually in our whole state. So you're nearly detecting all the species or close to it on average that are occurring in Missouri at wetland areas. And you go farther down the list and it's just the same thing. And then you pull out, these are just our MDC conservation areas that are wetlands. It just really shows the value of that public land, which is all part of this relevancy conversation. So other information that I pulled from eBird, and this information is outdated, it's from 2018, but just gives you some context again. So this is a little bit of a measure of how often these areas are birded, not how many birds have been detected or recorded. but the number of checklists, how often people are out there. So by number of checklists, we can see the Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area is kind of, you can, in a way, say the top birded area in the state, according to eBird data or eBird checklists. And so, you know, when you pull out the conservation areas, again, you can see how valuable our public lands are. And, you know, we see national wildlife refuges in there and other things like that. It's just all of these are examples of ways that you can pour through these data. So kind of, I did a very rough analysis of Missouri eBird data back in 2018. I downloaded all the data from 2014 to 2018 in Missouri. And that was just all Missouri hotspots, all the data from Missouri. And so give you context of how big these files are, which I know Scott will talk about more. There were 3.1 million lines of data, which again, compared to some of the heavily birded states, the coastal states, this is probably nothing. But there are 3 million lines of data because when you download these data, you're downloading one line of data for every bird species detected on a bird checklist. So you can imagine it's a lot. There were 197,000 unique checklists, almost 6,000 unique eBirders. Those are not Missouri eBirders. Those could have been people traveling through, but it was that unique number of eBirders, folks who had traveled through or visited Missouri to bird, had uploaded eBird checklists in the state during that time. And then I just pulled out the conservation areas, which when I say conservation areas, those are our agencies managed areas. There's also state parks, but that's run by a different agency in Missouri, Department of Natural Resources. But all that's valuable. All of those are state managed lands and part of this discussion. So when I pulled out just the conservation area, there were a lot fewer lines of data. There were 22,000 unique checklists, but all of this gives context to how important or birded or eBirded our conservation areas are compared to statewide. And all of that I think is very valuable. So when we look at unique eBirders submitting checklists in Missouri by year, we're just going to go through a few slides from this rough analysis I did downloading all of our eBird data. And I had to use the program SAS to consolidate and run this rough analysis because there were just too many lines of data for Excel or something like that. And I am not a guru on what's the Microsoft database? Oh my gosh, that's embarrassing. I don't remember what it's called. You all know what I'm talking about. But I'm not savvy enough with that to manipulate the data. So you will have to either use yourself or find someone who can use SAS or R, but Scott's going to talk a lot more about that. So when we look at the eBirders submitting checklists in Missouri by year, really here I just wanted to show that how much eBirding and those unique birders out there are increasing over time, over the last 5 years, and just the popularity of eBird and how it's really ramping up. So we see that go from about 850 eBirders to over 1,600, so almost doubling. So unique eBird checklists totaled by year, and this is statewide. This is all the data, not just conservation areas, but these are the number of checklists, kind of a measure of how much people are birding. But again, I make this note at the end of the presentation too, but eBird is a modest way to quantify birders and birding in the state. It's just one way that we can quantify. I would argue it's one of the only ways that we have to quantify outdoor use on our public lands or statewide in general, especially bird watching. You know, this is really changing over the last 5 years. More and more people have gotten a lot more comfortable with eBird and signing up for it, not being intimidated or scared to detect, to record all species heard. They encourage you to record all species heard and seen, and that can be intimidating to some folks. You know, 5 years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, eBird used to just be for the hardest core birders. And I don't think that's the case anymore. It's just really ramping up in popularity. So this is the number of checklists. We just see increase there, more than double, just trying to tell that story. This is unique checklists only on our MDC managed conservation areas. And you see a little bit of an increase, not necessarily doubling, but an increase there. And then unique eBirders submitting checklists, again, just on our conservation areas, a subset of that. They didn't like us in 2015, apparently, for some reason, but we see an increase in general over that time. And then this is eBird checklists on conservation areas only, the top 25 visited conservation areas. So within that, you can talk to your area managers. Hey, your area is the most birded area, conservation area in the state. What are you doing to reach out to birders? How are you engaging that audience that is clearly using your area? and they're using them year round. You're able to pull out these data and tell area managers, you have this many eBirders on your area throughout the year. These are the peaks. You know, how do we start that conversation? What does that look like? Trying to engage birders on our areas. Another thing I wanted to point out that's really interesting, you can manipulate these data in many, many ways to go down a lot of rabbit trails. But I wanted to point out that on our most checklist heavy conservation area, Eagle Bluffs, and one of the lower ones, Ted Shanks, they're both wetland areas. This was again part of the wetland discussion we had. That even though there were much fewer, there are about 5% of the checklist at Ted Shanks, and there was only a difference of about 58 species. So in my mind, Eagle Bluffs is a lot more birded because it's right outside of an urban area in Columbia where I live. So clearly you can see that on eBird that the areas next to urban areas are way more birded. But even then, the wetlands at Ted Shanks are providing just as much habitat that with 5% of the visits, they recorded nearly very similar numbers of species. So again, part of lots of different conversations in our agencies of how valuable wetlands are to different bird species and diversity and things like that. This is year-round use by month at one area, at that Eagle Bluffs area. So this just shows number of checklists submitted at different times of year. So clearly it's a wetland area, migration is king, and people are most excited in the spring to get out there. But you go to Eagle Bluffs, there are like 15 to 20 cars pass you just driving in and out of that area daily. It's very heavily burdened. This is another rough analysis we did just recently, where we pulled out the number of Missouri eBird checklists from the last decade, 2010 to 2020. On the far left map, you'll see 2010, and each colored dot represents a different number of checklists, red being over 20. So you see those concentrations. So in 2010 is far left, 2020 is in the middle, and then combined 2010 to 2020, you see a lot of really valuable information there. A lot of our relevancy discussions are sometimes how do we appeal to folks in our urban areas, that non-traditional audiences that we may not have made much of an effort to reach out to previously. Well, clearly our urban audiences are the ones driving a lot of these eBird data. So this is clearly Kansas City, Columbia, where I live, St. Louis, this is Springfield, Missouri, and you can even see the highway between all of them, I-70 across the middle of the state. And so it's just really interesting to see those effects too and map them out like that. So this is Missouri only. This is eBird checklists for Missouri only. Clearly there's an annual growth, but nothing compared to 2020. You see that really big peak, and this is just for Missouri. So North Carolina and Idaho have also done this with a lot of their data as well. So I don't want to say I'm the only one who's done it. Denez Agan in Idaho has done this with her data, and clearly Scott has. He'll talk about his cool interpretations and analyses of these data as well. So we, on this recent analysis of 2010 to 2020 data, we had to do a subset. We had to pull out just April through August birding, which I know has its issues, but we tried to incorporate a month of migration in each of those, but there was just way too much data. So this is just April through August of 2010 to 2020. This is just on Missouri state-owned lands. So it's both our agency with the triangle and Missouri State Parks. And you see a lot of growth there, and especially in 2020. So you could tell lots of stories even about, you know, what happened in the year of COVID with outdoor use. So this is the same trend with increasing eBirders in the state. This not only captures birders from Missouri, but clearly those passing through. We see an increase until 2020, which no doubt this is due to less travel and fewer eBirders traveling into the state for birding due to COVID. But there are more checklists in 2020, meaning that that shows us that fewer birders in the state were submitting more checklists at this time of year in this year than previously. So it shows us that the eBirders we had in the state who maybe weren't traveling in and out submitted more checklists because 2020 people were out birding a lot more. Okay, so I just want to throw in a few slides since we mentioned 2020 and COVID of how eBird tracked that as well and tracked that use. And so birding from home. So eBird has an option to set up a yard list on the website and in your app. So in spring and early summer 2020, new registrations for eBird yard lists were up 900%. And that's because people were stuck at home and birding in their yards. Then when you look at the larger trends, so the Cornell Lab of Ornithology runs eBird. It runs the Macaulay Library, which is the largest repository of bird media, whether it's audio clips from, the 50s or 30s or 40s, all the way through to video uploaded, new audio uploaded, photos. Anytime you upload photos or any media on an eBird list, it's thrown into the Macaulay Library now, which is amazing. You imagine just how much media is in there. And then Merlin is the bird ID app run by Cornell, and it's kind of built to be paired with eBird. So Merlin is a free bird ID app. They're all run by Cornell. So these are the stats from the full year 2020. When we look at eBird, downloads, checklists submitted, were up 25.8% from the previous year. Observations were up 24%. You look at the Macaulay Library, video archived on the Macaulay Library in 2020 alone was up 7,314%. These numbers are just crazy. And then you look at eBird, which is the bird ID app, which is some measure of people getting interested in the outdoors and starting to bird. The app installs were up almost 80%, and the web sessions were up 490%. Like, these percentages are just crazy, and you see the trends there on the maps for 2020. So I wanted to compare how 2020 compared to an average year, which I used 2019 as an average year. So compared between the 2 years, this is eBird checklists submitted by month in the 2 years. They're very similar trends. There were even more checklists in 2020 with fewer eBirders. You'll remember from a previous graph. So this is neat stuff. I'm shocked that with fewer birders, the trends were nearly the same with the number of checklists. And that just shows you how many people were out there and getting new to this hobby and downloading eBird and getting out there and bird for their mental health, for their physical health, to deal with all the stress of this last year, physical and mental stress. So all of these data I think are really, really intriguing. I wish I had more time to devote to manipulating all these data. I know Scott does too, but now I'm gonna turn it over to Scott to talk a little bit about his manipulated in North Carolina. Then we will take a short break and then we'll move into his technical hour of the presentation. So thank you all, and I will turn it over to Scott.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. Are you going to advance slides for me? Awesome. So yeah, I just wanted to run through a couple examples from North Carolina and some of the similar stuff that we've done that Sarah has done. And just when we started thinking about this, and especially in terms of the birding trail, we had no idea how to quantify whether we were being successful or not. And so that was one of the reasons we started playing with eBird data. So when you do have eBird data like this is data from Hyde County in North Carolina on the coast. And you start looking at patterns of this is both checklists in white and observers in orange, and just the seasonal patterns by month of when that happens. So this county is home to Pocosin Lakes and Lake Mattamuskeet wildlife refuges. And so they're major overwintering areas for waterfowl, and that's a major draw for a lot of bird watchers. And so this explains sort of the dominant number of checklists in January and February. And these also might be bolstered by Christmas bird count data, because there are a couple circles that occur in Hyde County. Note that the ratio between the birders and the checklists submitted is not constant. And to me, that means that like maybe people are traveling there in this winter months to, specifically to submit checklists. So, and there's more work to be done to sort of test that kind of hypothesis on what those two measures are telling us. So then I wanted to contrast this with a mountain county. So if you could go to the next slide, Sarah. We have a county here, Yancey County, which is in the mountains of North Carolina, where Mount Mitchell is. We see sort of a different pattern that's dominated by May and June birding, when high elevation birds are on their breeding grounds. We also see a spike in September, likely because of the draw for hawk migration. A lot of people go up there the same reason, or the same time of year for hawk migration. And Yeah, well, these patterns don't seem surprising, obviously, but the possibility of attaching numbers to them makes the ability to develop the messaging a bit easier. And then this other case study that I wanted to sort of walk through was is about our Wings Over Water festival. And that festival occurs every sort of October and sort of in October every year. And it's mostly dominated by volunteer-led trips in 5 counties on the North Carolina coast. And so you can go to the next one, I think. So yeah, those are the 5 counties. There's a lot of people who attend, and I just kind of wanted to see like what does this festival have in terms of bringing people to that area of the state. And so I looked at those counties the week of and 2 weeks prior, the eBird data for those, and definitely saw a significant increase. Now these numbers don't look too big, right? Because they went from 79 to 649 checklists submitted during a similar time period. And observers went from 24 to 87, but then you see the checklist observers, and since these are groups going out, then they can share a checklist, and that I think that number is more indicative of how many people it brings to the area to do some birding, and then plus hours per party there. Obviously, it does bring some measure of visitation to the region. So then we decided to go one step further with that and look at, of the people who birded during that Wings Over Water festival, how many of them, what is their lifetime birding list in eBird, just to see, are these world travelers, are they locals, like where are they coming from? And so this is a map of all of their checklists for their entire life. So I had to run a script to go through the entire database, which took a long time, and comes up with this map. And we see that the average Wings Over Water eBirder had visited 4.6 countries, and 108 countries were represented in total, and each of them had submitted an average of over 1,000 checklists in their lifetime. So these were clearly some avid birders that were either resident or brought to the area because of this festival. You can even see that it looks like somebody took a trip down to Antarctica. And you can go to the next one. So this kind of sends this message. If you have high quality habitat, you can bring in outside visitation and boosting local economies. And so there's some other ways that we've found to use this eBird data. And so I guess I'll pass it back to Sarah if you were going to talk a little bit more about interpretation of eBirds, and I don't know what other slides you had for this section.
Yeah, not a whole lot. Just to wrap up, thanks, Scott. Yeah. I love that map of the folks who participated in that festival and where they've traveled. It's kind of creepy how all of those data are available on eBird, but it's all anonymous. It's not like we could look up who they are or anything, which makes me feel a little better. But that's just so fascinating to me. That's really cool. So again, just to drive home this point of this is a lowball estimate of birding use and the number of birders out there. So as I said, I think more and more people are warming up to eBird and downloading the app and using it. But there are many other birders and wildlife viewers out there who don't use eBird. But that number is increasing every single day. I would argue that this is one of the only ways that we were able to even track outdoor nature use during a global pandemic. Or just it's the only way that a lot of our agencies can even track outdoor use, period. I know, speaking for Missouri, on a lot of our conservation areas, they're in rural areas on gravel roads where you pass one to get, through gravel roads. It's not just it's always at a dead end where you can put like a car counter on the road for people to drive over. And even then, you don't know what they're doing out there. You don't know if they're hunting, they're hiking, they're bird watching, they're just hanging out in the parking lot. And so it's one of the only ways that we can even track that. It's very powerful. And so this is just, I know that Scott will cover this, and really on the main eBird website, you go down to the very bottom and you click request data, and Scott will talk a lot about what you do after that. I do want to mention that over the last 2 or 3 years, I've had a few meetings with eBird folks who work with the programming and have their hands on the data all the time about how can we make these data more accessible to states. Not all of us have experience with R or SAS. I barely do. I was like remembering all the code I used for my master's when I used SAS for my analysis. I know many of you are probably the same, or we just don't have time, or we don't have someone in our agency who may be a database manager or able to manipulate these data. I think most of us will probably have someone who can use SAS and R, but getting on their schedule, we all have these barriers. And so I just wanted to update everybody that I have a meeting with eBird next week to talk about like a real path forward of what we can do to get these data accessible, where they either quantify that for states or whether a few states can pile on and give some, budgeted funding to help do an agreement to make this accessible. They have to do some coding on the back end to make, to pull those data out, whether we wrangle states to send us a shapefile of all your conservation areas or wildlife management areas so they can pull out those data to quantify those. But we'll figure that out, and I will follow up with folks after that discussion. But we are working, me, the Wildlife Viewing and Nature Tourism Working Group, also the Wildlife Diversity Program Managers. I know it's on their agenda to figure out if they can help provide those data to states. I've presented to them on this as well. And so there are multiple groups trying to work to get these data out to you to be useful, especially during all of these relevancy discussions. So with that, I will just say thank you guys for your time for this first hour. I hope you stick around for our more technical part of it. And if you all have questions that you would like to ask right now before the technical part that we can answer or that pertain to what we covered in the first hour, you are welcome to do so. Shelley, if you have questions from the chat.
Thanks, Sarah and Scott. There aren't any questions yet in the chat, but I will keep an eye open. And if you have a question, there are about 40 people on the call, so it'd be great to raise your hand and we could call on you. I guess my only question is, do you need support in next week's meeting with eBird, or do you feel good?
I feel good. I mean, I've talked to these guys like a few times already. They know the deal. They know what we're trying to get at. They know what we're trying to do with relevancy. They're very excited about it. They want to be, them as eBird want to be as relevant as possible to states and be as useful as possible in conservation and in state agency work. And so you guys are welcome to attend if you'd like. But I'm just trying to figure out a path forward of what exactly they need from us and what an amount would be for some sort of agreement moving forward. So I think it's fine, but you're welcome to attend if you're interested.
That sounds good. No.
In many ways, I think they're just a victim of their own success. eBird has been so successful, and you saw those trend lines like going up. A lot of that is new people picking up eBird, and that's. I think they have to worry about their servers going to get overloaded, those kinds of technical issues as well. And I think that's one of their factors for thinking about it. They could move in a million different directions, and they're trying to handle that.
Yeah, they're drinking from a fire hose for sure.
Rick in Georgia has a question have there been efforts to pull and use data from other wildlife viewing related apps such as iNaturalist?
I have not personally. I've just looked at eBird, but Scott, do you have input on that?
Yeah, I don't. I think, the way Cornell has managed it is pretty unique in the fact that they offer it freely, pretty freely at least. And I don't think iNaturalist has that same business model. I think they keep their data pretty close to the vest in terms of data that's not. Like, you can create a project in iNaturalist and you have access to all that data, but as far as I understand, there's no open access to the rest of the data. So unfortunately not. That would be cool.
Plus, I have a feeling that eBird data would dwarf iNaturalist data, just because I think that there may be a lot less data. Maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe not. But it's funny, to give some context. I've had lots of questions when I first started with eBird about, well, I wish there was an easy way to put your breeding bird survey data into eBird, as you go, so you don't have to submit it separately. And really the comment from eBird and the part of the discussion is, I mean, BBS data, even the whole history of BBS, which you could enter historic data, which would be valuable, but even all the data from BBS is literally such a drop in the bucket compared to the massive amounts of eBird data that are being submitted every single year, that it would help hone it a little bit, but it's not like it's going to revolutionize like the clarity of the data. It's just, there's so much data coming in. It's just mad. It's exactly what Scott said. They're kind of a victim of their own success.
We have a question from Minnesota as well, that an area manager for a WMA has 6 different eBird hotspots. Can they request editing those hotspots to make them more reasonable? And I'm assuming, I guess, what do you mean by more reasonable? Or maybe Sarah and Scott know, like consolidating them into one? Is that what you're meaning? Or narrowing 6 down to 3? What is more reasonable in your mind?
That's probably what they mean. I mean, not to assume what they mean, but I mean, we have that same problem in a lot of our conservation areas. Some of our biggest, like wetland areas in particular, there's like 4 or 5 hotspots. Missouri has a hotspot coordinator for eBird, where if there are requests, it's a centralized person where you can request like the name changes or consolidation. But Scott, do you know how they choose hotspots, or what that level is, like how many checklists submitted before they make a hotspot? I know that when we have some like rarities in the state and lots of people are going to these exact same spot, or over time, you know, people are going to the same spots, it turns into a hotspot. But I don't know how they choose those, but it has to be area sensitive, you'd think, like on these really big areas. But I would reach out to them to see if there's a hotspot coordinator for your state or your region, and maybe ask them.
Yeah, actually, I don't know for North Carolina. I should know the answer to that question, but I don't. I know that the issue of hotspots is challenging, especially we're doing a bird atlas here in North Carolina this year, and for the next 4 or 5 years. And you know, one of our instructions to atlasers is don't select the hotspot, because it could be in a different block than where you are. And so when you choose the hotspot, it actually assigns the location of the checklist to where that dot is in that park, whatever that park is for that hotspot. So you're losing a little bit of spatial resolution there when people choose a hotspot, because they have a couple choices. They can choose the hotspot, they can choose a location that they've chosen previously, or they can choose like where they're standing when they select the location. And so you can make some assumptions about which one they're choosing, but there's not a hard and fast way to sort of pull those out. So there's a little bit of spatial slop in that data. So
yeah, and I think they're able potentially to be a little sloppier with that, just because there is so much data. You know, I've heard other arguments where it's like, we'll choose the hotspot because that's what they're using to look at like changes over time, because you don't want a million personal locations in there. You want to like track the same areas over time. So it's all part of the discussions of how to use it. It's the best way.
To throw on top of that, like the reason hotspots are so sticky right now, why they don't want to get rid of them or switch them in any way, is that birders use them. Like, I am the top birder at hotspot X, and they really love that. You know, they love that sort of competition. And so if you're asking them to like, well, don't choose the hotspot, choose your location. Well, you know, now they're getting bumped down on that list of top eBirders for that hotspot. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of challenges with the hotspots.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah, there was a comment about how you've given a lot to look into already, and it was very helpful and fascinating. But I don't see any additional questions. Has anything come up into your head since you stopped talking?
No, other than I hope that we figure out some way to make this more accessible. I mean, it's all right there. I mean, you guys can compile these stats right now if you just find someone who has R or SAS. And it's really, you know, the dinky little graphs I showed. I mean, I am not a statistician. I am not an R master. In some way, like, if I can do it, you can do it. It's just compiling the data in different ways and organizing it in different ways. You know, there's a line for each species. So you want to like filter out by checklist. Each checklist has an ID number. And so you want to filter out by like the first line of each checklist so that you're only getting one line of data per checklist, stuff like that, like just tedium like that, where you have to think through what you're actually getting with each command, like how you're filtering the data and what you're getting out of it, and trying to consider things that I mentioned in mine of like, well, this isn't just eBirders from my state, you know, and for a lot of your other tourism driven states, you really want to pay attention to that. To like, you can also look at, you know, top number of eBirders that are submitting the most checklists in your state. And that is very eye-opening too, where there's a ton of checklists that are being submitted by the same 10 people. And that's not for nothing, but you know, it's just all part of the story of reading the data and trying to figure out what all that means.
That's always been a wish list of mine, is to do, not necessarily learn exactly where people live, but you could categorize people by states by their looking at their you know, you're going to have more checklists in your state than you do your home state than your visiting state. So you could potentially, you know, I could look at North Carolina, all the checklists submitted in 2020, and see how many of those people were likely not in North Carolina, and compare that to other years, or don't live in North Carolina, and compare that to other years, which I think would be fascinating, but sounds like it would take like a week for my computer to chunk through that.
Yeah, it would take a long time. Another thing I want to mention as part of the hotspot discussion is, you know, a year ago or 2 years, I guess it was 2 years. In my mind, 2020 isn't in the calculation, but we had talked about, you know, one of the first steps for eBird was to rename the hotspots CA or WMA so that they're all named the same. Well, I think we can get around that if we just use shape files from all the states. Of like, most states have a shape file of just their state managed lands. We just need to figure out a process with eBird of an agreement who's going to compile all of those state shape files and just send them all as a lump together, so they can just lift the data off of those geographic, like geospatial boundaries, rather than the hotspot name and having 5 hotspots that are the same conservation area, but they're named something different. We all
I have a
those
question
issues.
on that line. I mean, I know when we've had this conversation over the past few years, we've always talked about it as state managed lands, but some states might be more interested in like their birding trail only,
Sure.
which includes state managed lands, federal lands, municipal lands, private lands. Like, it includes a lot of different things. So I guess in those conversations with eBird, I'd be curious if they'd be up for a data set that's as big as that. I mean, in Texas, that's over 900 sites, not 90. You know, if it were just our state managed lands, it would be 90 parks. But if it's our wildlife trail sites, it's 920 plus sites, which is actually more interesting, I think, in terms of bird watching for us.
Sure. Yeah, and all of that plays into justification and relevancy of birding trail stuff as well, and other partners and things like that. I can't imagine it would be that much of a heavier lift to just get a shape file of all those areas in addition. I don't know if you have to create that or not, but you likely have it somewhere.
And now we have point data, but we would have, it's fine. I mean, legwork on our part isn't a big deal. We have a GIS lab. We could do it.
Yeah. Good question. All of these have been good questions.
All right, I have 3 minutes till. So if y'all want to take a 3-minute bio break, and we'll start at the top of the hour with part 2 of this. And you don't have to log out. You can just stay logged into Zoom as you walk away from your computer and come back. But just for those who've already been sitting for an hour, if you just want to stretch, whatever you need to do, get a drink of water, give you time to do that. And Perfect. If anything pops into your head, you can write it in the chat.
Great. I'm going to turn off my video and mute, and I will be back.
Hey, could you unshare before